The fluorescent lights in the community center hummed softly overhead, casting a pale glow over rows of folding chairs filled with neighbors, retirees, local business owners, and a few curious high school students. It was a typical New Hampshire evening, cool, quiet, with the kind of calm that makes you forget how loud the world can get. On stage, Karoline Leavitt stood at the microphone, crisp in a navy blazer, answering questions about border security, inflation, and her vision for the district. Her voice was steady, practiced, full of the kind of confidence that comes from months on the campaign trail. But in the third row, near the aisle, a woman sat with her hands folded in her lap, listening closely. She wore a simple gray sweater and jeans, her dark hair pulled back in a low ponytail. To most in the room, she was just another face in the crowd. But if you looked closer, if you noticed the way her eyes narrowed slightly when certain phrases were used, or how her fingers tapped once, twice, against her knee, you might have guessed she carried something heavier than the average voter. Her name was Elena. She'd served 12 years in the Army, most of it as a combat medic. She'd patched up soldiers in dusty outposts, held hands during medevacs, and once spent 3 days straight without sleep after an IED tore through her convoy. She didn't wear her service like a badge. She carried it like a second heartbeat. Always there, sometimes quiet, sometimes loud, but never gone. Earlier that week, she'd seen a post on social media. Karoline Leavitt had shared a short video clip with a caption that read, "Veterans who struggle after service often just need to take more personal responsibility. The system isn't perfect, but hard work beats excuses every time." The words had hit Elena like a punch to the chest, not because they were shouted in anger, but because they were said so casually, as if the years of waiting for VA appointments, the nights spent in a rusted-out Honda Civic because rent was too high, the grief of burying 2 friends who couldn't outrun their demons, were all just matters of poor choices. She hadn't planned to speak up that night. She'd come mostly to listen, maybe get a sense of whether this candidate truly understood the people she claimed to represent. But as the Q&A began and question after question rolled by, about taxes, about schools, about gas prices, Elena felt a quiet pressure build inside her. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was more like the feeling you get when you've been holding your breath too long and finally need to let it out. When the moderator called for one last question, Elena raised her hand. "Yes, ma'am." "In the third row," the moderator said, pointing. Elena stood slowly. She didn't rush. She took a breath, smoothed her sweater, and walked to the open mic near the front. The room turned toward her. Karoline Leavitt smiled politely, ready for another policy question. "Thank you for being here," Elena began, her voice calm but clear. "I'm a veteran. I served overseas, and when I came home, I thought the hard part was over. Turns out it was just beginning." A few people shifted in their seats. Someone coughed. "I saw your post this week," she continued, "the one about personal responsibility. And I needed to ask. Have you ever talked to a veteran who's been denied disability benefits 3 times? Or one who's waited 9 months just to see a counselor? Or someone who lost their battle with PTSD because the help came too late?" She paused. The room was completely still. "I'm not saying the system works perfectly," Leavitt replied, her tone measured. "But ultimately, each of us has to take charge of our own path. Government can't solve everything." Elena nodded slowly. "I agree. Government can't solve everything, but it can stop making it harder. When I got out, I had no job, no savings, and a shoulder that still aches when it rains. I applied for housing assistance. Got told I didn't qualify. Tried the VA for therapy. Waitlist was 6 months. So yeah, I took responsibility. I slept in my car for 6 weeks while working part-time at a grocery store just to eat. That wasn't lack of effort. That was reality." Her voice didn't rise. It didn't crack. But something in it made people lean forward. "And the 2 friends I lost," she added softly, "they weren't lazy. They weren't making excuses. They were broken in ways that no amount of hard work could fix alone. They needed real help, timely, compassionate, well-funded help. And they didn't get it." For a moment, no one spoke. Even the hum of the lights seemed to fade. Leavitt hesitated. I appreciate your service," she said finally. "And I'm sorry for your losses. But policies have to be fiscally responsible. We can't just throw money at every problem." Elena didn't flinch. "No one's asking for a handout. We're asking not to be forgotten, or worse, blamed." She stepped back from the mic. The room stayed silent for a beat longer. Then someone near the back started clapping. It was soft at first, then grew, until half the audience was applauding not out of politics but out of respect. Elena returned to her seat, heart pounding, not from nerves, but from relief. She'd said what needed saying. Not to win an argument, but to remind everyone in that room, and maybe someone beyond it, that behind every statistic, every policy debate, there's a person. A person who bled for their country, who came home carrying invisible wounds and who still shows up even when it's hard. Later that night, someone recorded the exchange on their phone. They didn't add dramatic music or flashy captions. They just posted the raw clip with a simple caption. A veteran speaks up, listen. By morning it had been shared hundreds of times, not because it was explosive, but because it was honest. Comments poured in, my brother went through the same thing. Thank you for saying this. Finally, someone telling the truth. Elena didn't check her phone much that day. She went for a walk in the woods behind her apartment, the kind of quiet place where the only sounds are birds and wind through the trees. She thought about her friends. She thought about the young soldiers she'd trained who were still overseas. And she thought about how strange it was that speaking one hard truth in a room full of strangers could feel like the most important thing she'd done since leaving the service. She didn't know what would happen next. Would the candidate reach out? Would anyone in power even care? But for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel invisible. And that in itself was something. The story wasn't over. In fact, it had barely begun. But that night in a small town hall under flickering lights, a quiet moment of courage had sparked something real, something that couldn't be ignored. 2 days passed and the world kept turning. But for Elena, everything felt different. She hadn't expected anything to come of that town hall moment. She'd spoken because she needed to, not because she thought it would change anything. But by the next morning, her phone wouldn't stop buzzing. At first, it was just a few texts from old army buddies. Saw you on that clip, proud of you. Sister. Then came messages from strangers. A nurse in Maine who'd worked with veterans. A teacher whose student's dad was struggling after deployment. Even a retired Marine who wrote, You said what I've been too tired to say for years. She scrolled through them slowly, sitting at her kitchen table with a chipped mug of coffee. It wasn't fame, nothing like that. But it was connection. Real, raw human connection. And that meant more than she could explain. The video had spread quietly, the way real things often do, not with fireworks, but with nods of recognition. Local news picked it up not as a political showdown, but as a community conversation. A radio host invited her to talk about veteran support gaps. She declined at first, she wasn't looking for a spotlight. But then she thought about how many people might be listening who felt just as alone as she once had. So she said yes and kept her answers honest, never angry, always grounded in what she'd lived. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, things were shifting in ways she couldn't see. Karoline Leavitt's campaign office was buzzing. Some staff members wanted to ignore the whole thing. It's just one person, one aide said. Don't give it oxygen. But others pushed back. That one person is speaking for thousands, argued a policy advisor who'd grown up in a military family. If we brush this off, we look out of touch. After a tense internal meeting, a decision was made. Reach out. Not with a press release or a staged photo op, but with a direct message. An email landed in Elena's inbox late that evening. It was brief, respectful. It thanked her for her honesty and invited her to a small off-the-record roundtable with the candidate and a few local veteran advocates. The goal? To listen, learn, and explore how policy could better reflect real-life needs. Elena read it 3 times. Her first instinct was to delete it. Politics had let her down before. Promises were made during campaigns, then forgotten after Election Day. She'd seen it happen to friends, to herself. Why would this be any different? But then she thought about the woman she'd been 6 months ago, sleeping in her car, too proud to ask for help, convinced no one would understand. If she said no now, was she closing a door that might help someone else avoid that same pain? She called her old squad leader, the one who'd pulled her out of a foxhole during a sandstorm in Fallujah. He listened quietly, then said, You don't owe them anything. But if you go for the ones who can't speak up yet. She also talked to her therapist, a no-nonsense woman who'd worked with veterans for 20 years. "Trust your gut," she said, "but don't let fear decide for you. You've earned the right to be heard." The next morning, Elena replied to the email. She agreed, but with conditions. No cameras, no reporters. Just a real conversation in a neutral space with no agenda other than understanding. The campaign accepted. As the day of the meeting approached, Elena didn't prepare talking points. She didn't rehearse speeches. Instead, she walked through her memories. The VA office where she waited 4 hours only to be told her file was lost. The night she sat in her car outside a closed shelter because it was full. The letter she'd written to Congress that never got a reply. She wasn't going to recite these like a script. She was going to carry them with her like stones in her pocket. Proof that this wasn't theory. It was life. The day before the round table, she visited the local VFW hall. She didn't go often. Sometimes the memories there were too thick, but she needed to talk to people who'd been in the same boots. She told them about the invitation. Some were skeptical. "They'll use your words and forget your face," one older vet warned. But others nodded. "Go," said a woman who'd served in the Navy. "Make them see us, not the idea of us, but us." That night, Elena couldn't sleep. Not from anxiety, but from something deeper. A strange mix of hope and caution. She'd spent so long feeling like her voice didn't matter. Now someone in power was asking to hear it. That was terrifying, but also meaningful. The morning of the meeting, she wore the same gray sweater from the town hall, not for symbolism, just because it was comfortable. She drove to the community center where the round table would be held, a small, unassuming building with peeling paint and a playground out back. No campaign signs, no security detail, just a folding table, 6 chairs, and a pot of coffee. Karoline Leavitt arrived alone, carrying a notebook. She looked different without the stage lights, less polished, more human. She offered a quiet, "Thank you for coming," and Elena nodded. No handshake, no fanfare, just 2 people sitting down to talk. Also, there were 2 other veterans, a former Marine who now ran a job training program for returning service members, and a young Air Force veteran who'd struggled with military sexual trauma and now advocated for better mental health access. They introduced themselves simply, first names only, and for a moment, the room felt less like a political meeting and more like a support circle. The candidate started by saying she'd watched the town hall clip 3 times. "I realized I'd been speaking in slogans," she admitted, "not solutions, and that's not fair to people like you." Elena didn't smile, but she relaxed a little. That was a start. What followed wasn't a debate. It was a conversation, sometimes awkward, sometimes emotional, but always real. The Marine talked about how hard it is to translate military skills into civilian jobs. The Air Force veteran described waiting 8 months for trauma counseling. Elena spoke about the shame she felt asking for help, as if needing support meant she'd failed. Leavitt took notes, asked questions, didn't interrupt, didn't defend, just listened. At one point, she looked up and said, "I've never met anyone who slept in their car after serving this country. I didn't know that happened." Elena met her eyes. "It happens more than you think. No one left that room with all the answers." But something had shifted, not because of grand gestures or promises, but because, for a few hours, a person with influence chose to sit quietly and hear the truth from those who'd lived it. When it was over, Leavitt stood and said, "I don't know how to fix everything, but I want to try, and I'll keep listening." Elena walked out into the cool afternoon air, the sun low in the sky. She didn't know if anything would come of it. But for the first time in a long time, she felt like she hadn't just been heard, she'd been seen, and that quietly changed everything. The weeks after the round table passed in a quiet rhythm: laundry, grocery runs, early morning walks with her rescue dog, a scrappy terrier mix named Scout. Elena tried not to think too much about what might come next. She'd said her piece. She'd shown up. That was enough. Or so she told herself. But then, one Tuesday afternoon, her phone buzzed with a message from the campaign staffer who'd coordinated the meeting. "We're drafting a new veterans policy platform," it read. "Would you be willing to review it before we release it? Your perspective matters." Elena stared at the screen for a long time. It wasn't a request for a quote or a photo. It was an invitation to shape something real. She almost said no. Old habits of distrust ran deep. But then she thought about the young Air Force veteran from the meeting, who'd whispered afterward, "If this actually leads to change, it could save lives." So Elena typed back, "Send it over." What arrived wasn't a glossy brochure or a list of vague promises. It was a working document, rough, detailed, full of specific ideas. Mobile mental health units that could travel to rural towns. A fast-track system for disability claims under 6 months. Partnerships with local nonprofits to provide temporary housing for veterans in crisis. Some parts were strong, others missed the mark. Elena spent 2 nights reading it line by line, making notes in the margins with a red pen like she used to do with field manuals. She pointed out what worked: the focus on early intervention, the plan to train VA staff in military culture, but she also flagged gaps. "You mentioned housing," she wrote, "but not how hard it is to qualify when you don't have a permanent address. You talk about jobs, but not how many employers still don't understand military resumes." She didn't soften her words. If they were serious, they'd want honesty, not flattery. To her surprise, they responded within hours. Not with defensiveness, but with questions. "Can you help us fix that?" they asked. "Would you be open to a follow-up call with our policy team?" She agreed, but only if the other veterans from the round table were included. "This isn't just my story," she said. "It's ours." The call happened on a rainy Thursday. 6 people dialed in: Elena, the Marine, the Air Force veteran, 2 policy advisors, and to Elena's quiet surprise, Karoline Leavitt herself. For 90 minutes, they talked through every section. The Marine suggested adding apprenticeship programs tied to veteran skills. The Air Force veteran pushed for mandatory trauma-informed training for all VA intake staff. Elena advocated for a peer support network, veterans helping veterans, because sometimes the only person who truly gets it is someone who's been there. Leavitt didn't dominate the conversation. She asked clarifying questions. She took notes. At one point, she admitted, "I didn't realize how many layers there are to this. I thought it was mostly about funding, but it's also about dignity, timing, trust." "That's it exactly," Elena said. "It's not just about having resources. It's about feeling like you deserve them." By the end of the call, the document had changed, sharpened, deepened, made more human. And something else had shifted too. Elena no longer saw Leavitt as just a politician. She saw her as someone trying, awkwardly, imperfectly, but genuinely to learn. A week later, the revised platform was released. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. It included nearly every suggestion they'd made. Local news covered it, not as a campaign stunt, but as a rare example of policy shaped by lived experience. Comments poured in, some skeptical, some hopeful. One veteran wrote online, "For once, it sounds like they're talking to us, not at us." Then came the unexpected request. Would Elena appear in a short video explaining one part of the plan, the peer support initiative? Not as an endorsement, not as a spokesperson, just as someone who'd lived it. She hesitated. She didn't want to be used, but she also knew that if people heard this idea from someone who'd sat in that car, who'd felt that loneliness, they might listen differently. She agreed, but on her terms. No script, no makeup team. Just her in her living room with Scout curled at her feet. The day of filming, the crew was small, just 2 people with a camera and a mic. They set up near the window where the light was soft. Elena wore the same gray sweater again. Not for show. It was just her favorite. When the camera rolled, she didn't recite lines. She spoke like she was talking to a friend over coffee. "After I got out," she began, "I thought I had to do everything alone. Asking for help felt like weakness. But the truth is, the strongest thing I ever did was admit I couldn't do it by myself." She talked about how a fellow veteran had found her sleeping in her car and quietly paid for a week at a motel, not out of pity, but solidarity. "That's what this peer network is about," she said. Not fixing people, just walking beside them. She didn't mention Leavitt by name. She didn't say vote for or support this candidate. She just told her truth. When it was over, the videographer lowered the camera and said, "That was powerful." Elena just nodded. She wasn't trying to be powerful. She was trying to be honest. The video went up a few days later. It didn't go viral. It didn't need to. But within veteran circles, it spread fast. Messages came in from people saying, "That was me last year." Or, "I showed this to my brother. He finally agreed to call the VA." Even more surprising, A few local organizations reached out wanting to pilot the peer support idea, regardless of election outcomes. This shouldn't wait for politics, one director said. Let's start now. Elena helped them draft a simple plan. No big budget. Just trained volunteers, a hotline, and a promise. No judgment, just support. Meanwhile, Leavitt began mentioning the policy at events, but always giving credit. This came from real veterans, she'd say, not from a campaign office. Critics accused her of co-opting pain for votes, and maybe there was some truth to that. Politics is never pure. But Elena had seen enough to know the difference between performance and progress. This felt like the latter. One evening, as she sat on her porch watching the sunset, Scout resting his head on her knee, Elena realized something. She wasn't waiting for someone else to fix things anymore. She was part of the fixing, not as a symbol, not as a story. Just as herself, flawed, tired, but still willing to show up. And that, more than any headline or video, was the real victory. The election was still months away. Outcomes were uncertain, but something had already changed, not just in policy drafts, but in the quiet understanding that real change doesn't start with grand speeches. It starts with one person speaking up, and another choosing to listen. The weeks rolled on and the air grew crisper, carrying that unmistakable hint of autumn. Wood smoke, fallen leaves, the kind of quiet that settles over small towns when summer's noise finally fades. Elena kept her head down, tending to her daily routines, morning walks with Scout, volunteering at the local food pantry twice a week, helping organize a new peer support group for women veterans that was slowly, steadily growing. She didn't follow the news much. She'd said what she needed to say. The rest wasn't up to her, but the world hadn't forgotten. One afternoon, as she was sorting canned goods in the back room of the community center, her phone buzzed. It was a message from the Marine she'd met at the round table. They're holding a town forum next week, just veterans, no press, no cameras. Leavitt wants to present the updated plan in person and hear more feedback. You in? Elena sighed. Part of her wanted to say no. She was tired, not in the bone-deep way she'd been years ago, but in the quieter, more manageable way that comes from giving your all and needing a breath. But then she thought about the young woman who'd shown up to their peer group the week before, fresh out of the army, eyes wide with that mix of hope and fear Elena remembered so well. If showing up one more time helped someone like her get seen sooner, wasn't it worth it? She typed back, "I'll be there." The forum was held in the same community center where it all began, but this time the room felt different. Lighter somehow. Less like a battleground, more like a workshop. About 20 veterans showed up, some in uniform, most in jeans and hoodies, a few with service dogs at their feet. Leavitt arrived without a blazer this time, just a sweater and a notebook. She didn't take the stage. She pulled up a chair in the circle. She started by thanking everyone for coming, then laid out the revised veterans plan, not as a finished product, but as a living document. "This isn't mine," she said. "It's ours. And if it's missing something, tell me now." What followed was 2 hours of raw, unfiltered conversation. A former Navy corpsman talked about how hard it is to get prescriptions filled in rural areas. A National Guard member described being denied benefits because his deployment wasn't long enough, even though he'd been shot at for months. Elena listened, spoke when she had something to add, but mostly watched how the room had changed. People weren't shouting. They weren't performing. They were sharing like neighbors, not opponents. At one point, someone asked, "What happens if you don't win the election? Does all this just disappear?" Leavitt didn't dodge the question. "I hope not," she said, "because this isn't about me. It's about you. And if I lose, I'll still push for these ideas from the outside. But if I win, I'll fight to make them law." There was no applause, just quiet nods. That was enough. Afterward, as people milled about with coffee and cookies, Elena found herself standing near Leavitt by the window. Neither spoke at first. Then Leavitt turned and said, "I used to think policy was about big ideas. Now I see it's about small truths." Elena looked at her, really looked. "Just don't forget them once the cameras are gone." "I won't," Leavitt said. And for the first time, Elena believed her. A few days later, something unexpected happened. A local nonprofit that ran transitional housing for veterans reached out. They'd seen the peer support video and wanted to partner with Elena's group. "We have space," they said. "You have the people. Let's build something real. They met the following week. No politicians, no press. Just two teams of people who'd spent years patching holes in a system that kept springing new ones. They sketched out a plan, a safe house with veteran-run counseling, job coaching, and a 24/7 support line staffed by trained peers. Funding would be tight, but they'd start small. 2 rooms, 1 counselor, a handful of volunteers. Elena threw herself into it. She helped interview applicants, painted walls on weekends, even convinced a retired Army engineer to fix the leaky roof for free. It wasn't glamorous work, but every nail hammered, every bed made, felt like a promise kept, not to the country but to each other. Meanwhile, the election drew closer. Yard signs popped up, debates aired, but Elena stayed out of it. She didn't endorse anyone. She didn't need to. Her work spoke for itself. Then one rainy evening, she got a call from a reporter, not from a national outlet, but from the local paper. "People keep mentioning your name," they said. "Not as a political figure, but as someone who's actually building solutions. Would you be willing to talk about the Safe House project?" This time she said yes. Not for fame, but because visibility could bring donations, volunteers, maybe even a grant or two. She met the reporter at the nearly finished space, a modest house on the edge of town with a wraparound porch and a garden out back. Scout trotted beside her, tail wagging. They talked for an hour. She didn't mention politics once. She talked about the woman who'd cried when she saw her new room, her first real bed in 2 years. She talked about the veteran who'd started mentoring others after finding his footing. She talked about how healing isn't a straight line, but it's possible when you're not walking it alone. The article came out the next week. It was front-page local news, not because it was dramatic, but because it was hopeful. Donations trickled in, $20 from a retired teacher, $500 from a local business owner whose son was still serving overseas. A plumbing company offered free repairs. A therapist volunteered her time. None of it was huge, but together, it was enough. As election day neared, Elena noticed something else. More veterans were showing up, not just to her group, but to town meetings, to school boards, to city council sessions. They weren't there to protest. They were there to participate, and people were listening. One night, as she locked up the safe house after a long day, she stood on the porch for a moment, breathing in the cool air. Scout leaned against her leg. Inside, a light was on in one of the rooms. Someone was home. She thought about how far she'd come, from that car, from that silence, from believing her voice didn't matter. And she realized the unbelievable part wasn't the confrontation or the headlines. It was this: ordinary people choosing to care, choosing to act, choosing to build something better, one honest conversation at a time. The election hadn't even happened yet. But win or lose, something had already changed. Not because of a single speech or a viral moment, but because a woman spoke up, and instead of being dismissed, she was met with a willingness to listen. And from that small crack, light got in, and sometimes that's all it takes. Election day came and went like any other Tuesday in late autumn. Gray skies, damp sidewalks, the smell of wood smoke curling from chimneys. Elena voted early, then walked Scout through the quiet streets, her hands tucked in her coat pockets, her mind unusually still. She didn't check the news. She didn't refresh her phone. Whatever the outcome, she knew one thing for certain: her work wouldn't change. By midnight, the results were in. Karoline Leavitt had lost by a narrow margin. In another time, in another story, that might have been the end. The moment the unbelievable promise fizzled into political dust. But this wasn't that kind of story. The next morning, Elena opened her email to find a message, not from a campaign, but from a state representative who'd read about the Safe House project. "Your model is exactly what we need," it read. "Can we talk about scaling it statewide?" Around the same time, the local VA office called. They'd heard about the peer support network and wanted to explore a formal partnership. "We've been doing it top-down for too long," the coordinator admitted. "Maybe it's time to try bottom-up." Elena sat at her kitchen table, steam rising from her coffee mug, and let out a slow breath. She hadn't expected this. She'd braced for silence, for the usual post-election fade-out. But instead, something quieter and more lasting was happening. Real people, in real positions of influence, were choosing to act. Not because of who won or lost, but because they'd seen what was possible when you center human experience over political convenience. Over the next few weeks, The safe house became more than just a shelter. It became a hub. Veterans came not only for a bed but for resume workshops, therapy sessions, even weekend coffee circles where no one had to explain why certain sounds or dates hit harder than others. Elena didn't run it alone anymore. A former Navy cook handled meals. A retired Air Force logistics officer managed supplies. The young woman who'd shown up scared and unsure now co-led the peer training sessions. Healing, it turned out, wasn't just something you received, it was something you gave. And then, unexpectedly, Leavitt reached out. Not as a candidate, but as a citizen. She asked if she could volunteer. "I know I'm not in office," she wrote, "but I still want to help. Not for optics, just because it's right." Elena almost said no. Old instincts flared, distrust, caution, the memory of too many empty promises. But then she remembered the round table. The way Leavitt had listened without interrupting. The way she'd admitted she didn't have all the answers. So Elena replied, "Show up Saturday at 9 a.m., bring work gloves." Leavitt did. She painted walls, organized donation bins, and sat through a peer support training without once mentioning her campaign. She didn't take photos. She didn't post about it. She just worked. And slowly, quietly, the veterans began to accept her. Not as a politician, but as someone trying to make amends in the only way that mattered. By showing up consistently, humbly, without expectation. Months passed. Snow fell, melted, gave way to spring. The safe house expanded to a second building. A local college started offering free counseling internships there. A grant from a National Veterans Foundation allowed them to hire their first full-time case manager. None of it happened overnight. None of it was perfect, but it was real. Elena still lived in her small apartment, still walked Scout every morning, still kept her life simple. But now, when she passed a veteran on the street, they often nodded. Not out of politeness, but recognition. They knew she'd been where they were, and that she hadn't left them behind. One afternoon, as she sat on the porch of the original safe house watching a new arrival unpack her few belongings, Elena thought about that town hall months ago, the tension in the air, the weight of speaking up, the fear that no one would care. She'd been wrong about that. People had cared. Not all of them. Not loudly, but enough. The unbelievable part, she realized, wasn't the confrontation or the headlines. It was the ripple. One honest moment had led to a conversation, which led to a policy draft, which led to a safe house, which led to dozens of lives steadied, redirected, saved. Not by a hero, not by a savior, just by ordinary people choosing again and again to listen, to show up, to try. She never became famous. She never wanted to. But in her town, in her state, among the people who mattered most, her name carried weight not because of what she'd done, but because of how she'd done it, with integrity, patience, and a refusal to let pain go to waste. And Karoline Leavitt? She didn't disappear. She stayed involved, quietly advocating for veteran issues in local forums, using her platform not to promote herself, but to amplify others. She never ran for office again. Instead, she helped launch a nonprofit focused on bridging civilian-military understanding. Some called it redemption. Elena called it growth. Years later, when a young veteran asked Elena how she'd managed to create change in a broken system, Elena didn't talk about strategy or influence. She said, "I just refused to be silent, and I refused to give up on people, even the ones I didn't trust at first." Because real change, she'd learned, doesn't come from grand speeches or viral moments. It comes from showing up when it's hard, from listening when it's uncomfortable, from believing that even one voice speaking truth in a quiet room can start something that lasts long after the cameras leave. The story didn't end with an election. It didn't end with a victory speech or a policy signing. It ended, like all good human stories do, with connection. With a veteran sleeping safely under a roof. With a peer saying, "Me too." With a former candidate scrubbing floors not for credit, but for conscience. With a woman walking her dog at dawn, knowing she'd helped turn pain into purpose. And in a world that often feels loud, cynical, and divided, that kind of quiet courage, that's the most unbelievable thing of all.